So what's the Bible about? Why is this book important? Why do we make a big deal about this book? Why do we spend time in our worship every Sunday reading the Bible? And what does all that have to do with everyday life? What does this have to do with everyday life? And what are the stories that we find here? What do they have to do with Monday through Saturday? Some of these stories are millennia old. Why was the Bible written? How do we know our interpretation is right? Who knows what's right? Who's to say what's right? Who's to say somebody else is wrong in their interpretation? And how do we know that any of this is true? And finally, why do we make such a big deal about Jesus when we gather here? Now, we're going to answer these questions over the next few weeks. And these questions aren't just things that I've made up. These questions I've actually heard here. Conversations with some of you. Others here in Los Fresnos. It's always a fascinating conversation when these questions get asked. We're not the only ones asking these questions. 2/3 of Americans want to know more about what's in this book. Recent surveys show there's a lot of curiosity, a lot of interest, because people don't know. And more than half of Americans are curious as to how this relates to their lives. Oh yeah, it's an important book, but what does it have to do with me? They're not sure this even applies. Right? So we're going to do this over the next 8 weeks. Between now and the Easter season, we're going to cover this whole book. All right? It's going to be quick. It's going to be fast, obviously. What we're going to do is we're going to highlight some of the key events and people in the story of this book. And we're going to explain along the way why it is we make such a big deal about this book, why we make a big deal about Jesus, and then how this informs my decision making and how this applies. And then, hopefully along the way, how you can begin to read it and apply it. You know, one thing I didn't bring with me this morning, and I'll make sure we have some next week, is a Bible reading guide for 2020. We'll commit to reading the Bible together between now and the end of the year. And there are certain, if you've got one, stick with your plan. But I'll have some next week. So as we begin to think about this book and this story, and by the way, it is a book, 66 books, all contained within one book, what we call the Bible. One story. When was the last time that you had a good book that you couldn't put down? Anybody begin reading a story, begin reading a book, and all of a sudden it's like 2 o'clock in the morning and you got one chapter left and you are not putting that book down. We're going to 3 o'clock in the morning, right? Been there, done that. I'm a very voracious reader. If I get to a certain point, I'm not quitting. I remember there was a book that at one point was so good, it was almost like 5 in the morning. I didn't even realize it. But I was like, no, I am finishing tonight. Yeah. Movies. We get some of the same experiences. You know, when you read a good book or you watch a great movie, how many of you feel like you've been there, that you were part of the story? That was your story on screen. You walk out of the movie theater thinking, wow, I felt like I was there. Well, that's because great authors, great screenwriters, great movie producers, in fact, great actors and actresses. That's why they're great. They make you feel like you're part of their story. They have pulled you in and they're taking you for their ride. That's a great author. That's a great actor or actress. In fact, there are a couple of companies that we know, they make billions doing this for us. They've got a couple of theme parks. How many of you have been to Hogwarts? Right? What's the point of Hogwarts? You get to walk where Harry Potter walked. You get to walk in his experience, in his shoes. Disney, Magic Kingdom, for years. They got a castle. Little girls get to go and be a princess in the castle. In fact, Cinderella will show up. You can have lunch with her for a certain price, right? But what they're doing in every single ride, I'm fascinated by Disney. Every time I go there, I'm probably studying as much as I'm enjoying it. What they're doing is they're pulling you into all their stories. You know, the biggest point for Noelle when we took them as kids was she got to meet Ariel, because that was her hero. And she was pulled in. In fact, recently there was a story I read. This little girl finishes a good book that she's just read. She's, again, elementary school probably, reading a good book. She says, "Mommy, I'm sad. I want that to be my life." Oh, that's she's being pulled in. And that, if we were to really think about it, that is our great experience with a good book and a great movie. We want that to be us. They've pulled us in. Well, you know what? There's a Bible doing the same thing. This book. God's doing the same thing for us, to us. So we're going to begin a journey today. Hopefully for you it'll be the same. As we begin to see our story in these pages, pulling us in. Pulling us in. We're going to tell the story of Jesus because the story of Jesus is also our story. The passages that we read this morning allude to this. And what we read this morning, those words are for us, and they're telling us how we think about our story. You know, those words in Exodus, as I said, those are for a people that are on their way out. They've got their suitcases packed, and they are ready to go, and God has last instructions for Moses. And listen to what he says. Here's what he says. In the future, when your son asks you, "What does this mean?" say to him, "By the strength of his hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the place of slavery." It's the language. Lord brought us. You see, these aren't simply instructions for the people leaving that night. These are instructions for succeeding generations. In fact, when Moses writes, he's the one writing Exodus. He's the one writing it down. The audience that he's writing to, they're traveling through the wilderness. You know, they're part of that 40 years in the wilderness experience. This is another generation or two. Those are instructions for those who weren't even there. And his statement is for all of those who would live decades and centuries after that huge event in Israel's history. And Israel's fathers are to tell their children, this is what God did for us that night as we left Egypt. Now, anyone listening to a conversation like that begins to ask the question, what do you mean, us? You weren't there. How is it that they walked through the Red Sea? They weren't there. Yet the story of the Exodus and all the events surrounding it, that's their story. You see, the way God designed it, as the angel of the Lord is walking through Egypt, firstborns are dying, lambs are dying, and then he parts the Red Sea, pulls the people out. As those people experience that, they are experiencing that for succeeding generations. What's going on with them is the story of anyone who follows. And so God says, when your kids ask, hey, why are we doing this Passover again tonight? That happened 200 years ago. Here's what you're to say. God led us out of Egypt. He rescued us by his strong hand. That's what happens. You see, those people walking out on dry land through the Red Sea, they're not simply representing succeeding generations. They are succeeding generations in God's grand design. Anybody that follows is there in solidarity with them. What happens to them happens to others. And it's our story. Even the way the New Testament unpacks it, this little anecdote given by Moses helps us see that it's not simply the Red Sea that is the story for Israel and the story for us. This little anecdote that's given by God to Moses for fathers to talk, the way they talk to their children, that's the way we read our Bibles. All of the events in the Scriptures have this, that as we read this, what's going on with those characters, what's going on in the story, is our story, is the story for succeeding generations. It's as if we were there, because we are there. What's going on with these people and these stories in this book, even though it's 3,000 or 4,000 years old sometimes, has something to do with us, because God is treating it as if we were there. We're going to see that this morning. You see, this story starts in Genesis chapter 1. Again, Moses is writing this, and he's writing for this people in Israel. In Genesis chapter 1, if you know anything about it, very, very first chapter in the Bible, talking about creation. If you're somebody in the wilderness and you've left Egypt, and now you're wandering around, and you're a little kid, one of the things that you're going to ask your dad is the same thing that we ask or we talk about at university parties. That I'm sure you've asked or you've had these chats from time to time. It's those big questions in life. It's the stuff that drove Plato and Aristotle. The most basic question is, where did I come from? Where did we come from? How did we get here? What's going on? Somebody explain this to me. And that is what Moses is doing for the children of Israel in Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is where it all starts. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God. It's kind of interesting. This also is a question that gets batted around from time to time. In the beginning, God. Doesn't tell us where God came from. It simply presumes he exists. Doesn't even ask a question. Doesn't even try to explain it. Just in the beginning, God. Doesn't tell us anything about where God came from. It's a question we ask, but the text is not asking. And it all flows out from there, from that assumption. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the rest of this chapter and the next chapter are going to give us all the details that we're supposed to know about God bringing all of this into existence. In fact, John 1:1 goes even farther and says it was the Son of God there at the very beginning of time, and it was the Son of God, the one we now know as Jesus, who is breathing all of this stuff into existence by his word. He's speaking into existence from nothing. All of creation, the entire universe, made and created by the word of the Son of God. That's Genesis 1. Where we came from, spoken into existence out of nothing. Now, we're not going to jump into all the details of Genesis 1. But there are three things coming out of that whole experience and what's chronicled there that we need to remember. We'll probably come back to this from time to time. In fact, we alluded to at least one of these during the Christmas season. The first is the rhythm of night and day. That's by design. What's funny, as Greeks, as those of us who have inherited a Greco-Roman way of thinking, we tend to think of day and night. In fact, there's a day-night clinic, right? We think of the rhythm of day-night. But it wasn't originally set up that way. In fact, if you were a good Jew, if you were somebody reading this story back then, your rhythm was night-day. And God designs it this way. If you read that first chapter in Genesis, the evening and the morning were the first day. There's this rhythm of darkness and night, and then day and light. And that rhythm then goes throughout all of Scripture. Darkness is always invaded and intruded by day. Darkness always gives way to light. You see, there's hope even in the first day that God created. Second thing is a recurring statement throughout that entire chapter as Moses is talking about what God's doing, and that is God saw that it was all good. And God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was good. And God saw that it was good. Till he gets to the end, he goes, and God saw that it was very good. There's nothing wrong with creation. We can't miss this. Nothing wrong. It's a perfect order. There's no evil. There's no war. There's no hunger. There's no sickness. There's no getting up at 3 a.m. because the steak you just ate isn't digesting. It's perfect. And not only is the existence of Adam and Eve, and not only are they living this perfect life without sin, without evil, without sickness, without pain, without suffering, without sorrow, they're also in perfect communion, perfect conversation with the Creator. There's nothing wrong between the Creator and those He's created. And that brings us to the third thing, and that is that God created man last, and man is created at the very top of His created order. Which is a little different. Again, we think about worldviews a little different than what we're told in our society these days. That man is just part of the created order. No, the pecking order in Genesis 1 is man is different. Man's at the top. Man is created in God's image. So, no sickness, man in God's image, and man is then given responsibilities to fill the earth and have dominion over it. And the wording there is, because it piggybacks on it, this image of God idea, he is to fill the earth with God's image. It is man's responsibility to fill the entire globe with all of God's glory. That was his marching orders. Fill the earth. So man and woman are in perfect harmony in their perfect paradise with their Creator until it wasn't. And that brings us to Genesis 3. You see, part of this created order, God created two trees. He created the tree of life, and He created the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And hundreds of other trees. The garden was this botanical paradise, full of fruits, life. You can think of it, you name it in creation. It's represented somewhere in the garden. It was a beautiful, beautiful paradise. So many trees, but two special ones. And they were told, don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or you die. Well, chapter 3 in Genesis says this. Serpent shows up, and this is what happens. The woman saw that the tree, the one that they had been told not to eat of, was good for food and delightful to look at, and it was desirable for obtaining wisdom. So she took some of its fruit and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were open, and they knew that they were naked, so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. Oh. Wow. They ate of the forbidden tree. Absolutely devastating. This is catastrophic. All of human history is riding on this bad decision. And what was good, what was very good, is no longer good. The perfect has been destroyed. Now there is sin in the world. So you want to know why we have sickness? You want to know why we have pain, why we have broken relationships, why we have suffering, why we have evil, why we have war, why we have bad news on the internet and television? Genesis 3 is the answer. And because we were there, because Adam is there for us, we did this. We did this to ourselves. We have nobody to blame for all of the evil in the world except us. Why is life difficult? Why is it dark so sometimes? I have to look in the mirror and remind myself that I'm the problem. This is our story. Crash and burn, total failure. Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, and the one-on-one relationship with God is destroyed. It's done. Their whole world crashes, our whole world crashes. And into that mess, into that darkness then, God gives a promise. He doesn't leave it there. That's the great thing about Genesis 3. He doesn't stop there. God speaks words of grace, words of promise, even as He's cursing the serpent. By the way, these are words to the serpent. I will put hostility between you and the woman, between your offspring and her offspring. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. Spoken to the serpent, it's a curse for him, but for that man and that woman who are listening to this, that is a promise of grace. And then there's forgiveness. This unbelievable grace and the promise comes with unbelievable forgiveness. God made clothing from skins for the man and his wife, and He clothed them. This becomes a pattern throughout the Old Testament and into the New, and starts to become a fuller picture as to what is required, what has to happen when there is sin. God's promise is always accompanied by a sacrifice. God had promised that they would die. He promised to kill them if they disobeyed. Instead, it's an animal that dies, and they get to live to see another day. The covering of the animal is grace, because without that covering, they're doomed. And the Israelites, they begin to see in that moment their own sacrifices. Without the covering of those sacrifices, they are doomed. And this is our story. Story of Adam and Eve in a perfect garden gets ruined by disobedience to God, and ends with the promise of a Savior who's going to fix it all. He's going to restore that relationship. The seed of the woman, that offspring, isn't going to go without pain. He says, you're going to bruise his heel. You're going to strike his heel. But the upshot of that, in striking the heel, the serpent's head will be crushed. The end result is the Savior would crush the head of the serpent once and for all. And being bruised and broken, that seed is going to win deliverance for Adam and Eve and their posterity and anybody who sees this in faith. What's interesting about this promise, if we were to go into Genesis chapter 4, Adam and Eve have a couple of sons, and one son ends up killing the other one, and God gives them a replacement. A boy named Seth. In naming Seth, Seth means the appointed offspring. So, who did Eve think? Who did Eve hope was going to be the one who was going to fix it all? God gives her another son to replace the one that's been murdered. She's thinking, oh, hey, here's the child of promise. Here's the appointed one. Now we know the rest of the story. It doesn't work out that way. But the rest of the Old Testament, as we follow all the way through Genesis, and as we start to track this story throughout all of the rest of the books of the Old Testament and into the New Testament, we see this trajectory of this seed of the woman, this offspring, repeated over and over and over again. And by the way, the seed of the serpent, which seemingly is constantly trying to kill off the seed of the woman. That's the story of the Old Testament. Two seeds, two offspring. One is the Messiah, who's going to fix it all. And the other is the seed of the serpent, who's trying to stop it all. That's our story. And so we get to the end of what we call the Old Testament, and then there is this little baby that is born in Bethlehem. And finally, the one that had been promised shows up on the scene. The one who would fix it all. The one who was the one who had been promised way back in Genesis 3, thousands of years before. Born in that manger. And then the author who writes most of the New Testament sees this about that baby who grows up and then is crucified and rises again. The famous missionary Paul says this: "Sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin. In this way, death spread to all people, because all sinned. From one sin came the judgment, resulting in condemnation. By the one man's trespass, death reigned through that one man. Through one trespass, there is condemnation for everyone. Through one man's disobedience, many were made sinners." You hear the rhythm? You feel the rhythm? Through the one and the many, the one and the many, the one and the all. We all died in Adam. We all sinned in Adam. When Adam sinned, we sinned. We were all made sinners. You know, the moment Adam and Eve ate that fruit, that was our doom. Again, all of human history has a stake in what Adam and Eve are doing. The death of Adam was the death of all of us. I had a 10-year-old son who we had this conversation, and at one point he says, when he realizes this, where one guy is making the decision for billions of others, "Dad, that's not fair." That's not fair. It's not fair that our destiny was riding on the line when Adam decided that he was going to disobey. How's that fair? The implications are we would not have fared any differently. Nobody's better than Adam. But the reality is, the way God set it up, we all died. He really was eating the fruit on our behalf. That was us eating the fruit. We are in Adam. Paul, who's writing this, understands that. It's kind of depressing. We sin because we are sinners. We don't become sinners because we sin. We're born in sin. It's already there. Because of Adam, who did it for all of us. It's kind of depressing. All of life's brokenness, all of the bad news. I'm a sinner. We all sin like Adam. We're all doomed. And we're all destined to live apart from God and be kicked out of the garden. We're all destined to live out in the wilderness unless we have that promise to come and fix it for us. And that's exactly what happens. And I selectively chose those words from Romans 5 because that's not the whole story. Paul finishes those sentences. Listen to the rest of the story. Through one man's disobedience, the many were made sinners. So also through one man's obedience, the many will be made righteous. And then he continues right on into Romans chapter 6. Same thing. All of us who were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death. Therefore, we were buried with him by baptism into death, in order that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too may walk in newness of life. That's grace we don't deserve. When Christ died, I died. Just like I died in Adam, well, the seed of the woman shows up, and yes, he dies, but he crushes the head of the serpent, and in doing so gives us life. So that when Christ dies, I died. When he rises from the dead, I rise from the dead. Do you hear the echo of Exodus here? And when When we came out of the Red Sea, we came out of Egypt through the Red Sea, that was us. Well, when Christ was dying, we were dying. When Christ is rising, we were rising. That's the good news of the gospel. I deserve eternal damnation, and yet He gives me paradise and life. All of His blessings are there in Jesus. That is our story. I sinned in Adam. I died in Adam. I died with Christ. I rose with Christ. And it all happens here in Romans 6. Paul explains it all happens to us through baptism. I'm given new life in baptism. This is the story of the Bible. This is our story. This is how I am brought into that story. Through faith, through the waters of baptism, Christ's life becomes my own. Unbelievable grace. Here's what John has to say then about all of this. These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is that Messiah, is the anointed one, is the promised one of the Old Testament, the Son of God, and by believing, have life in His name. You see, all of this whole Bible, all of this was written so that I would come to have faith in the seed of the woman who came and fixed it all. The one who crushed the serpent's head at the cross. By believing, have life in His name. John, right here, is writing the thesis statement of the Bible. You want to know what's happening in the Bible. You want to know why the Bible was written. Why is it that God bothered? He didn't have to. Why is it God bothered to give us this? John has it. This is written so we wouldn't be on our own in ignorance, so that we wouldn't be doomed, so that we would believe that this one that had been promised is the Messiah. This Jesus is that promised one. And by believing, have life in His name, to cause us to believe. You see, Eve did not live to see that promised one. She did not live to see the Messiah. She thought she had it in Seth. She was good to think that. In fact, most of the characters in the Old Testament are always looking for that one. Eve didn't get to see it, but Mary did. And we get to see it. Jesus is the promised one who restores the garden, restores us to a relationship with our Father, and makes it all right. Tell me your story. Our story. My story. We've heard it today. God made a perfect world. He created us in His image. We had perfect communion with our Creator, and then we blew it. We rebelled, we sinned, and brought death into the world, but God gave a promise, and He made good on that promise in the person of Jesus. That's written so that we might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and by believing, have life in His name.